Well, last week we began to consider how the book of Exodus highlights the truths about God eliciting trust in Him. We began to learn things about God to help us know God better, and it should cause us to trust God more. The more we know about Him, the more we can trust Him. And you may recall we observed some things that Exodus teaches us. God keeps His word. And we saw this as we began to look at Exodus last week. He fulfills His promises. He made promises to Abraham. In the book of Exodus, we see that God was fulfilling those promises. Israel had gone down into Egypt as 70 people and had grown into a great and mighty nation, so much so that the king of Egypt relied on them economically, but feared them militarily. That it was afraid that they would rise up against Egypt and overpower them, and so they sought to squash them and control them and enslave them. By the end of Exodus, God had made good on His promise to deliver the people from Egypt. So as we look at the big picture, that Exodus is about the exit. And it begins describing the situation and the promise that God would bring them out, a promise that had made hundreds of years earlier, and God did it. And so God keeps His word. We also saw that God is patient and merciful. And as we go through the book of Exodus, we see even when God is greatly provoked, that He's patient and He withholds punishment often for a long, long time. And He gives people much time and opportunity to turn to Him. We look at Pharaoh from a perspective of, well, he was a king and God was just punishing him. But we can also look at Pharaoh and recognize that God gave Pharaoh a command, let my people go. And he says, okay, if you're not going to let them go, then I'll do this. And now let them go. And if you're not going to let them go, then I'll do this. And so we have 10 plagues that are recorded, and each one of those plagues demonstrates an opportunity for Pharaoh to submit to God and be obedient to God. But Pharaoh hardened his heart to the point where God eventually hardened his heart. And so we see God's patience and mercy in the case of Pharaoh. We see His patience and mercy in the case of Moses. Moses had fled from Egypt. God appeared to him in a burning bush, as described there in Exodus. And God says, go do this. And Moses says, I don't want to. That's paraphrase, right? And Moses came up with an excuse, and God answered that excuse. And then he came up with another excuse, and God answered that excuse, and just on and on and on. And there's a couple chapters devoted to God and Moses. God says, go do this. And we know that delayed obedience is disobedience, and we desire, when we tell someone to do something and they should do it, that they do it without arguing or complaining. But Moses argued and complained. And God was patient. And God was merciful. And He was patient with the Israelites. And He was merciful to them. As soon as things got a little bit hard, they said, all right, we give up. We quit. We'll just stay here. We'll be slaves. We don't want Moses. We don't want you to deliver us. Leave us alone so it won't be so hard for us. But God was patient with them, and He was merciful towards them, and He didn't turn and walk away. He was faithful to His promises despite their disobedience. And as we go through the book of Exodus and through the other accounts of the people in the wilderness, we see God's patience and mercy demonstrated over and over again. And then we Thirdly, we pointed out that God knows our lives and he cares. He knew what was going on in Egypt, and he cared about it. He knew about their troubles, and he was working to do something about it. It wasn't in their time frame, but God knew and he cared about them, even though it didn't seem like it to them at times. And so today, as we continue to see in Exodus, we see that God reveals himself to people that they will know him, that they will trust in him, that they will respond to him in faith. There are some things about God we can learn from creation. We look at the world around us and we see just amazing things. And we can see God's power and his creativity and certain aspects of who he is. But God has interacted in human history to reveal himself to people, to us, that we might know him. So we find in the book of Exodus, both implicitly and explicitly, both stated and implied, is that God was making himself known. And God makes himself known in part by what he does. And it's repeatedly stated in the book of Exodus that God was doing what he was doing with a purpose, and that purpose was so that people would know him, or so that they would know something about him. So we want to look at those statements. For example, when Moses first approached Pharaoh about letting the people go, if you want to turn to Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Remember Pharaoh's refusal to let the people go, but it's quite profound the way it's stated in verse 2 of Exodus 5. Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron, the elders, Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord." I do not know Yahweh. The capital Lord is God's personal name, and so Pharaoh had gods that he worshiped. He knew those gods, but I don't know Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, and besides that, I won't let them go. By the time God is done sending the plagues, Pharaoh knows much more about Yahweh than he did before. Right? And he does let the people go. God said he will let them go. Pharaoh says, I won't let them go. And we see as we see what God does, we also learn about God. Let's look at other statements here in Exodus chapter 6, verse 7. So Exodus was this historical event. Even unbiblical historians know about the Exodus. People who don't believe in biblical history understand that there was these people who came into Egypt, and they left Egypt under these dire circumstances. And the Bible gives us insight into that history and archaeology doesn't discover on its own. But in chapter 6, verse 7, it says this. God says, I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. And so God tells Israel that as a result of my deliverance, you will know who I am. The Exodus as a whole served to reveal to the nation Israel who God is. You will know. After this is over, you're going to know who I am. And as you read through the Old Testament, you find a couple statements, kind of a refrain that's repeated throughout the Old Testament about God, who he is. I am the creator. I made the heavens and the earth. And I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Okay? And so, as a result of the Exodus, the Israelites would know. But not only the Israelites, go over to chapter 7, verse 4. Chapter 7, verse 4, it says, when Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring the sons of Israel out of their midst. So not only was the Exodus revealing to Israel who God is, it revealed to the Egyptians. The Egyptians would know. Not only did the Egyptians and the Israelites know, but as we read through the scriptures, there's other people that for decades, even centuries, who, because of the Exodus, they knew that Yahweh had delivered the people of Israel from Egypt. It was 40 years later, we read in Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, about a woman named Rahab who was a prostitute in Jericho. And by this time, the Israelites are near the city of Jericho, and the spies have come to Jericho. And in Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, Rahab, this woman who lives in the land that God is going to give to the people of Israel, she says this, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And so 40 years have elapsed, and Rahab says, I know Yahweh is going to give you this land, and everybody is terrified because we know that God brought you out of Egypt and he parted the Red Sea and you passed through it. It was nearly 500 years later, during the time of Eli. The Israelites had been unfaithful to God. They had come to treat the Ark of the Covenant as a religious symbol, that if you carried the Ark of the Covenant into some place, and God would bless you. And so they carried it into battle against the Philistines. They had been defeated before the Philistines. And so they said, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant here. Let's bring our rabbit's foot here, and then God will defeat our enemies. And so when they did that, in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 8, it records their words. The Israelites cheered whenever their ark came into their camp, and when they heard it, they said, woe to us. This is bad for us. Who shall deliver us from the hands of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. And so it's been 500 years since the Exodus, and the Philistines are like, oh no. Oh no. This God, the God of the Hebrews, is the one who brought the plagues upon the Egyptians and brought them out. Even today, the plagues on Egypt are part of our common language. Even today, when something terrible happens, a plague comes upon the earth, people will speak, even CNN newscasters will say something like a plague of biblical proportion. What are they talking about? They're talking about the plagues that came upon Egypt. And so God specifically says that the Exodus will cause people to know who he is. And so it was by God's design. God delivered Israel in the way that he did. It was purposeful so that people would know him and respond to him in faith. There are also other specific things we find in the book of Exodus that we learn about God and who he is. Exodus chapter 7, verse 17 says this, "Thus says Yahweh, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it shall be turned to blood. And the fish in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking the water from the Nile." And so it says, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Our Bibles, most of them say the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's God's personal name. God has a name, and that name is Yahweh, sometimes Jehovah, translated Jehovah. But God's name has a meaning. Sometimes when kids are given a name, their name has a meaning. Well, God's name has a meaning, and his name means I be, I exist, I am. That's the name translated Yahweh is this idea of a one who exists. And so as he says, by this you shall know I am Yahweh. I exist, I be, I am. By his bringing the plague upon the Nile River. By doing what he did, he was making people know that he is the self-existent, eternal God who has the power over all creation. In chapter 8, verse 10, a plague of frogs has come upon the land, and Pharaoh says, okay, I give up, I'll let the people go, just get rid of these frogs. And Moses says, well, when? You tell me when, so that you know that God is doing this. And so he says, Exodus 8:10, tomorrow. So he said, may it be according to your word, that you may know there is no one like Yahweh, our God. And so by sending away the frogs, killing off the frogs at a particular time, it was made known that Yahweh is God, and he is God, and there is no one else like him, that you may know. And he did it at that time. And it's really quite amazing when you think about it. God sent the plague, and Moses says, okay, when do you want him gone? And he says, okay, sure, that time. And Moses went and prayed, and that was it. At that time, they were, that nobody else, no other God could do that at that time. Exodus chapter 9, verse 14. As he's speaking about the next plague, he says, for this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, so that you may know what? Know there is no one like me in all the earth. No one in all the earth like God. It makes sense. When you take a step back, if you have faith in the Bible, God is the creator. He made all things. He is in control of all things. He has the power over all things. There's no one else like him. No other gods like him. Chapter 9, verse 29. Moses said to him, as soon as I go out of the city, I will spread out my hands to Yahweh. The thunder will cease. There will be hail no longer, that you may know that the earth is Yahweh's. And so here he says that there's hail and thunder and lightning, fire from the sky, and it's pummeling and destroying everything. And Moses goes out and he says, all right, I'll go out and I'll ask God and it will stop. And by this you will know that God, Yahweh, is God over all the earth. The earth belongs to him in every part of it. You know, we say there's things that belong to us. We say, my car, my house, my land, my whatever, pencil, my... But everything we have, everything that is ours, belongs to God. It really doesn't belong to the county or the governor or the president. It belongs to God. Doesn't mean that they don't have any jurisdiction over it, but it gives us a different perspective. The earth is God's, and everything on the earth is God's. And by God demonstrating his power over the thunder and the hail and the lightning, and then turning it off like a switch, whoop, off. It belongs to God. The earth is Yahweh's. Chapter 10, verse 2. So God is giving instructions to Moses regarding Pharaoh. And he says the purpose of God performing these plagues, these signs, these wonders, these miracles, verse 2, is that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. And so the Exodus, God's signs and wonders, were not only for the Israelites, but for the Israelites to communicate about what God had done for them. And so we've talked about the Passover and the Passover celebrations. And so, you know, we kind of read it glibly and casually, but it was a tremendous event. And so here, generations later, the celebration of Passover is there was a time when our people were slaves, and this was going on, and this was happening, but Yahweh cared about us, and he knew about us, and he sent Moses, and he sent plagues upon the Egyptians, and they let us go. And God did all of these things, and he spared us. And so and this was to be communicated. Exodus chapter 11, verse 7. And so some of the plagues came upon all of the land, but others of the plagues, they only came upon the Egyptians, not the Israelites. Exodus chapter 11, verse 7. But as for any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may know how Yahweh makes a distinction between Israel and Egypt. Exodus chapter 14, verse 18, and the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I am glorified through Pharaoh and through his chariots and horsemen, and as they're in the Red Sea. And so the book of Exodus serves to help us understand who God is. He alone is God. He is the self-existent one. The earth belongs to him. He's able to control all of these things, the lizards and frogs and the bugs and the weather and turning the Nile to blood and just the plague, the death of the firstborn. How did that work? And so as we read Exodus, as with the rest of the scriptures, we learn about God. And as we learn about God, we trust in him more because we know him better and we know what he's really like. Our faith has an object. And if our faith, if we believe something about God that's not true, then that's unbiblical faith. That's really idolatry. We're worshiping something that's not true. And so it's important for us to understand the scriptures. It's important for us to personally read and understand and remind ourselves of who God is. So we know God by understanding what he says and what he does. Next, God is powerful. The power of God is demonstrated throughout the book of Exodus. Go back to Exodus chapter 6. God tells us that it is by his power that he would bring them out of Egypt. And so in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. This idea of an outstretched arm. The term arm refers to strength. And so God, by an outstretched arm, by his power, will deliver them. You know, their situations must have seemed terribly hopeless. It must have seemed desperate. The idea that somehow, after all of this time, that they would somehow be set free, that they would no longer be slaves, that somebody would care about them, that they would be important and significant, that someone would give them their own land where they would work for themselves and God and not for the Egyptians. It's just so fantastical that it just must have seemed impossible, but God said he would do it. You know, sometimes in our lives, we look at the situations we're in, the situations around us, and we have a tendency to despair, to fret, to worry, to be filled with anxiety. You know, maybe I'm just getting old, but it seems like things in our nation are pretty unsettled. A lot of uncertainty. You know, for a number of years, a number of cycles, our elections have been pretty wonky. They are looking like they're going to be that way. The moral fiber in our nation is just so many things you can wring your hands about. Grandmothers are afraid for their grandkids of what the world is going to be for them. Mothers are afraid, right? And I think that's, just kind of a common thing. But no matter what we're anxious about, is God in control? Is God going to accomplish his purposes? Is he going to be faithful? Does he know about us? Does he care about us? Will things be hard for us? Well, maybe, probably. Is God capable to deal with those things? God is powerful. And so the Israelites, he says, I'm going to deliver you with an outstretched arm. I'm going to redeem you. It must have seemed impossible. Exodus chapter 9, verse 16. God says to Pharaoh, he says, for this reason I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, in order to proclaim my name throughout all the earth. You know, God's capable of opening up the ground and swallowing up people. He does that. He did that with Korah and those who were in rebellion. And God could have done that with Pharaoh. Like, where did he go? You know, where's Pharaoh at now? He was here and there was a little earthquaking. He could have done that, but he says, I've allowed you to remain in order to demonstrate my power and proclaim my name throughout the whole earth. We could talk about the plagues and how the plagues demonstrated God's power. We don't have time to do that, otherwise I'll come back a third time. But the plagues were miracles revealing God's power over creation. A miracle is a supernatural event that defies the natural order of things. And so as we look at the plagues, it's like, how did that work? Well, we can't explain it. Sometimes the miracle is an aspect of timing, and we see that as well, that God uses natural events in order to perform a miracle because it's a miracle of timing. I think that was the case with the Jordan River, that God caused a big landslide to block off and dam up the Jordan River way upstream, and the Israelites passed through. The dry land part, well, that had to be miraculous because it takes a long time for a river to dry up. But as we think about the 10 plagues, the blood and the frogs and the lice or gnats and the flies and the death of livestock and the boils and the hail and the thunder and the death of the first, all of those things were like, boom, the power of God. And if you study those things carefully, you recognize, and God specifically states, that he brought judgment upon the gods of Israel. Each one of those plagues targeted something that the Egyptians worshipped. They worshipped the Nile River and so forth, and all of these different things. And so in the plagues, God showed that he was greater and more powerful than not just one, but for all of the gods of the Egyptians. And of course, they worshipped the pharaohs. Typically, the pharaohs were the firstborn, and the death of the firstborn was a judgment on the pharaohs. You know, sometimes miracles can be faked, right? The first of the plagues, the magicians of Egypt were able to duplicate, it says, with their magic arts. However, soon they were unable. And they came to Pharaoh, and this is what they said in Exodus 8:19. The magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. We can't do this. You know, some of those who claim to perform or witness miracles today are more like the Egyptians of Egypt than they are like Moses. Miracles of Moses, Jesus, the original apostles, were of a nature and a magnitude that there is no doubt it is the work of the finger of God. In the book of Exodus, this was the case. It was clear that these were not just random things that happened by coincidence or through natural means or through some sort of sleight of hand or sorcery. And first of all, it was told what was happening. This is going to happen, and then it happened. Right? And so God says, I'm going to do this, and then that's what happened, just what God said. It was a sign that God was doing it. See, it's God doing it. It was a sign. It was a miracle. It couldn't be explained by natural explanations, and it was awe-inspiring. It was wonder, created wonder in people. The last of the plagues was only on a select group of people. All the people were there. Oh, that one, that one, that one, that one. They died. Explain that. How did that work? I don't know. Sometimes it's good not to be the firstborn, right? And so God is powerful, and we see his power demonstrated. Lastly, we also see that God is relational. God is relational. Some people see God as distant, removed, that God created everything, just kind of left us to our own devices. But in Scripture, in the book of Exodus, we see that God is interactive and relational. He wants a relationship with people. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices that people can woodenly follow. But a relationship is intimate, and God is much more interested in a relationship than he is in religion. It's easy for us to get it turned around. Many people follow a religion, but they have no relationship with God. And people can practice Christianity or Judaism as a religion, but they probably have no relationship with God, and they're probably not saved even though they go through the motions. And if we're just going through the motions of religious observances without knowing God personally, then we're missing the boat. We've gone for a long, long walk off of a very short pier. We've missed God's purpose. And so we find here in the book of Exodus, God calls the Hebrews, he says, my people. Let my people go. These are my people. We know that term. They're my people. They belong to God. They have a relationship with God. It was because of God's relationship with Abram that Israel is recipients of the promises of God. That's where that all began, how they became God's people. And God had given them Genesis that they might know him. In Exodus, they saw his works and his acts, that they might know him experientially. We have the truth of God and we have the experience of God. Most of you probably are not aware, but over the years I've written many books about the truth of God. I've recently finished a book about the experience of God. It should be here next week, and hope to have one to give to you next week. And so we see not just the facts and the truth, but there is an experience. And so Exodus is very much about experience, about seeing God at work in their lives. And so in Exodus 19, we see that they've come to the mountain, and God calls them my people, but he wants them to call him their God. And he proposes entering into a covenant with them, and they agree. They become his people. It's kind of like marriage, that God says, okay, this is who I am. We've spent this time together. I brought you out of Egypt. This is my resume. This is my history. This is my background, the book of Genesis. And if you will obey me, I will be your God and you will be my people. And in Exodus 24, they have a covenant ceremony. It's like a wedding. Not quite like our weddings, but they make these vows to one another, and they have these things that they do, and they enter into a covenant with God and become God's special people. It's a two-way street. It is a relationship. And so as we finish out the book of Exodus, we find that it's devoted largely to God coming to live among them. There's all the details of the tabernacle, and we sometimes forget that the tabernacle was in the center of the camp of the people, and in the center of the tabernacle was a place called the Holy of Holies, and God appeared over the Ark of Covenant, over the mercy seat, inside of the veil, inside of the tabernacle, inside of the courtyard, in the midst of the people. And during the day there was a pillar that appeared, a pillar of cloud, probably a shiny cloud, and over at night there was a fire there. God was there. He revealed himself in a physical way, that he was in their midst. And when they finished the tabernacle at the end of the book of Exodus, it tells us that they've completed the tabernacle, and a cloud filled the tabernacle. They weren't able to go in there because God was in their midst. And so God is a relational God, and he wants to have a relationship. He wanted a relationship with the nation Israel, and of course Jesus came in order to deliver us from our bondage of sin, so to speak, and to bring us into a relationship with him through Jesus Christ. By the power of the resurrection from the dead, Jesus brings us into a relationship with God by knowing him and having faith in him as the gift of God, a God who is patient and merciful and has grace. And so what Israel is as a nation, we are individually before God. The book of Exodus teaches us that God can be trusted. And these are some of the truths that we find in the book of Exodus. As Exodus fits in part of the whole Old Testament, if you wanted to summarize the Old Testament, it's really simple. There's a lot of things that are difficult to understand in the Old Testament, but it's really simple. This is the message. Israel was unfaithful. God was faithful. That's what the Old Testament is about. And so Jesus came to bring Israel into a faithful relationship with God, and we get the benefits of that as well.